Graphic 45 week on the Paper Crafters Library blog. Every day this week we'll be featuring different projects using Graphic 45's gorgeous tropical travelogue collection. Today's project is a set of 3 4-inch by 4-inch Botanica canvases designed to be used for wall art. And I've broken it up into 2 separate videos. In this video, I'm going to show you how I created the Botanica canvases themselves. Now make sure you watch the first video showing you how to create the memory glass framed images using the faux soldering technique, because you're going to need to know how to do that in order to complete your canvas. So let's get started. So I went to my local art store and I purchased a set of 3 4-inch by 4-inch stretched gallery style canvases, and they came in this 3-pack for somewhere around $7, so very inexpensive for per canvas cost. And here you can see there's the smooth side of the canvas, and then this is what the reverse looks like, and there you can see it from the side. So once I had decided on the size of my mixed media piece, the next thing I did was choose the patterned paper that I wanted to use on top. Now I don't always work with patterned paper on my canvases. Sometimes I apply my paint or other mediums direct to the canvas. But in this case, I really wanted to use the Graphic 45 Tropical Travelogue collection. So I chose this muted pattern of paper called Botanica to go with the images that I was planning on putting on the canvases. Now this is cut to 3 13/16 by 3 13/16. So once I had decided on the pattern of paper that I wanted to use, my next step was to choose the colors of paint that I wanted to use for the side of the canvas, because of course you don't just want to put your paper on your canvas and leave the sides blank, because then they're going to be white unfinished. I wanted to add some color to them. So I looked in my stash, and the colors that I chose were from Golden and their fluid acrylics, Titan Buff, which you can see is this very kind of neutral cream or beige color, and a transparent yellow oxide. And now what brand you use doesn't really matter. I really like the Golden fluid acrylics. They're an artist quality paint, so they are going to be more expensive than your regular craft paint. If you're just planning on doing a few canvases, then you'd probably be more economical to buy it from your craft store. If you're really getting into mixed media and art journaling, then you may want to consider investing in some of these paints. But choose your paint colors based on the colors in your pattern paper. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cover the sides. Now I have my palette. This is just an inexpensive palette from Michaels. I have my water tub with a nice big flat brush, you can see here, and of course my canvas. And I'm working on my Ranger nonstick craft mat, something I love to work on whenever I'm doing any of my mixed media work because it cleans up so easily. So I'm starting by placing quite a bit of my Titan Buff color on my palette and just a tiny bit of transparent iron oxide. Now you could use this, paint this with a paintbrush, but I actually sometimes really just like to go in there with my fingers. And I'm going to do each side in exactly the same manner, so I'm just going to show you the one side. But what I'm doing is I'm dipping my finger, and you can see here I have a generous amount of paint on there, and I'm spreading it along the side of my canvas and bringing it down a little bit. I don't want to see any white when this is on my wall, and I'm also bringing it up again because I've cut my paper so that it's a little bit smaller than the top of the canvas, and I don't want any of that white showing. So as you can see here, I've got it coated with the Titan Buff. So I'm now going to take my finger and very carefully pick up just a very tiny amount of my iron oxide color, and then I'm just going to pull it across the side of my canvas. And I don't want to blend it too much. As you can see, I'm blending it a little bit. Each time I'm only picking up a tiny amount. I'm blending it a little bit into the paint, but I don't want the colors to blend too much. I want to see that variation in shade. I want to see some of the darker, some of the lighter. And then I am bringing this up on the side just a little bit. So there you can see what that looks like, and you can do that as much or as little as you want. If you find that you go over and you add a little bit too much on there, then it's very easy to go back with more Titan Buff, cover it up, and start all over again. So now that this side's done, I'm going to dry this with my heat tool, and then I'm going to finish off the other 4 sides, and then we'll be back. So I finished painting all 4 sides of my canvas, and my next step is to add my paper. So for that, I have this nice wide brush, and I've made sure I've absorbed all the moisture I can because it was sitting in my water bucket, and I'm going to be using this Claudine Helmuth Studio Multimedia Matte by Ranger, one of my absolute favorite mediums for collaging or decoupaging papers and for my mixed media work. So I'm just taking my brush and I'm applying a very thin coat. The key whenever you're doing any kind of collaging, decoupaging of papers is you don't want to saturate the paper in your medium too much, because if you do, the moisture in the medium seeps into the paper and causes buckling. Now, a lot of times it's hard to avoid buckling completely, but as long as you follow the guidelines and tips I'm going to share with you, then you'll notice that you'll have much better results. So I've applied my thin layer of medium, and I'm putting my paper on. Now, it's helpful to have, you can have a brayer to help smooth it. You can also use something like a craft scraper, oops, like this, that you can just very carefully run along the edges of your paper. And what you're trying to do is get out any pockets of air or air bubbles. So you just want to smooth it out against the gel medium, get rid of any air bubbles, and make sure the paper is well adhered. Now, there is a wood frame around the perimeter of this, as I showed you when you saw the back. So there where the wood frame is, I'm applying pressure and sticking the paper down. Any place where you see it's not sticking because maybe the gel medium dried, you can just carefully lift up and then add a little bit more underneath. For the center of the paper, I'm just going to flip this over and then stick my finger in the middle of the canvas. You can see I'm reaching through the center and just press it down against the table. And then as a final step, I'm going to dry this with my heat tool. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to make sure that that medium underneath the paper is very dry before I go ahead and apply another coat to the top of the paper. It's all part of trying to make sure the paper doesn't get too saturated with moisture to avoid buckling, because right now it's applied perfectly smooth and I want to keep it like that. I don't want it to bubble on this particular project. Sometimes in some of my other work I don't really care if it bubbles, it looks kind of cool and adds extra texture, but in this case I want it to be nice and smooth without the bubbles. So once it's dry, I'm going to take my brush again with some more medium, and I'm going to spread this medium thinly across the top of the paper, making sure that I also come over the sides of the paper as well. I want to make sure it's really well sealed, because I don't want any moisture seeping underneath as we're working with our paints and mediums. And I'm working in coats. So here you can see I've got a thin coat. I'm going to dry it, and then I'm going to repeat the process 2 more times. So I now have 3 thin coats of my multi-medium matte that have been applied to this surface of this paper and then dried in between. So my next step is to now start layering on or adding my paints and my layers to this. Now whenever I work with paper on a canvas or in an art journal page, you don't want to just leave the paper as is. I mean, you could, and it's pretty, but the whole principle behind art journaling and mixed media is you add your own personal touch to it. And one of the ways I do that is by adding different layers of mediums on top. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I really like the postmark pattern on the paper, is I do want to be able to still see that through, because it also in mixed media you want to build layers, because each layer just adds to the depth and dimension. So I want to add layers without obscuring what's underneath. So to do that, I'm going to create a wash on top. So I'm starting with my brush. So you can see I'm dipping my brush in water, and then I'm just running it along the side to take off most of the water. But my brush is still quite wet. And then I'm taking just a tiny little dollop of my Titan Buff paint, and then I'm using my brush to spread it. And if I find it goes on thicker than I want it to be, then I just rinse my brush off in the water, and then I can pull some of that color off. The other thing you can do is take, if you find you added too much, is take a baby wipe and then just carefully pull back some of that color. Whenever I work in layers, I much prefer to apply thin layers and then build rather than add too much at once. So here I've got my first layer of wash. I'm going to dry that, and then we're going to move on. So my first light wash of the Titan Buff is dry now, and I think what I'm going to do is add a second light coat. So I've got my brush, same way that I did before. So my second coat of my wash is now dry, And the next thing I'm going to do is pull in a little bit of that same yellow that I used on the side, the transparent yellow iron oxide, and put a little bit on the top to kind of tie the side and the top in together. But I don't want it to be too intense, so I'm dipping my finger in the Titan Buff, taking a little bit of the transparent yellow iron oxide, and then I'm just patting it on my palette. And as you can see, I just have a very small amount, and I'm just going to rub it across the canvas just a tiny bit. As you can see, it gives quite an intense yellow, so I don't want too much of that. And if you find it too yellow, you can always go back with some water or with a baby wipe to kind of wipe it down a little bit. So as you can see, I don't know if the camera picks it up, I've added just a little bit, and you can see there's just a very light tinge of the yellow. So for my next shading, I'm going to take this Faber-Castell Pitt Artist Pen Big Brush, and it's the 169 color. And this is an India ink inside, which is going to dry on any surface. But the nice thing is it doesn't dry right away, so you have a little bit of time that you can blend it. So I'm going to keep my water close by here so that I can wet my finger. I'll actually go ahead and do that first so that my finger's damp. I'm going to take a little bit of my pen, and then with my damp finger, I'm just going to spread it along the edges and bring it inwards a little bit. And there you can see how it's added just that nice shading. And what that does is it creates some extra depth, visual depth and dimension to your project. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to all four sides. And when you're doing this, what I recommend is that you always start a little bit lighter, and then if you want it darker, you can always go in and build up the color. You have to work in small sections and fairly quickly when you're working with this India ink, because although it doesn't dry immediately, once it dries it's permanent. So if you don't work fast enough and it dries on you, you can't do much. You can't do much about it. You're stuck with a shading color that's too dark. So there you can see what that now looks like. And I may go back and add a little bit more later. Our next step now is to add some stamping.